The next on-page SEO element worth discussing is subheadlines. So on every page, you want to have your main H1 headline, but you also want to break it down into subheadlines further down the page. So, for example, here's a subheadline. This page, you can see here's the main H1 headline, but it's also broken down into subheadlines right here. It breaks up the text. Now, why do we want to do this? Well, it's really funny when you get into psychology of people visiting websites and web pages. What they typically do, and what you typically do, whether you realize it or not, is when you land on a page that you've landed on for the first time, what people typically do is they don't sit there and read the content from top to bottom. What actually happens is they will land on a page and they will scroll down the page, scanning headlines, scanning to see what the content's about, maybe scanning to see how long the article is going to be. And they will do this either going all the way down to the page or at least to a section that catches their interest. And once they've found out that this article is worth reading, it's then that they scroll all the way back up to the top and actually read the article. This is typically how people view web pages. So in order to take advantage of this, first you need to understand it, which is good, but you need to make your content scannable. And one great way to do that is through subheadlines. So these right here. Now, if I actually look at the source code here, we'll get into some of the technical details. So as you can see here, this is an H2 tag. So remember, the main headline is an H1 tag. Well, on this particular site, it's an H2 tag. Now, on some of my own websites, I believe this is an H3. Could be an H2, we'll see. Okay, so that's an H3. That is perfectly fine as well. You can have H2 tags and H3 tags, but I wouldn't really recommend for most people anything below that. So you can actually go H4, H5, H6, H7, etc. But for a majority of web pages, you should stick to H2 or H3. And the reason is Google and other search engines place a little bit more weight if they're an H2 or an H3. So they place the most weight on if it's an H1, which is usually at the top, but they place a little bit less emphasis, but still a little bit, if it's an H2 or an H3. Now, unlike that rule that we talked about with H1s, where you should only have one unique H1 on a page, that doesn't apply with H2s and H3s. You can have as many H2s and H3s as you want, as long as it makes sense for that article. So in this article, for example, step-by-step guide to writing powerful headlines. If you add 10 steps, for example, and I'm not sure how many is actually in this, but if you had 10 steps, it'd be perfectly fine to have 10 H2s. So step 1, step 2, step 3, etc., all being H2s, and breaking out the content that way. Now, when you write these subheadlines, it's the same general principles apply. You want to make them eye-catching. You want to try to take advantage of keywords if you can, because remember, you're getting a little bit bonus weight in there. But they're basically just a way to break up your content. So really focus on the user experience when you're writing subheadlines, and treat each subheadline kind of like its own little mini article. So again, let's get into a little bit of the technical details of how to do it. So in WordPress, you can select some text and usually use the drop down and select if you want it to be an H2, H3, etc. You can also go into your text editor, and this is the actual formatting you use. It's very simple. It's just H2 followed by your headline and then the closing H2 like that. And if you want it to be an H3, again, you would just change, you would just change it to H3. Now, it really depends on your website, how it's set up and the styling, whether you should use H2 or H3. It really doesn't make that much of a difference either way. They both will work perfectly fine, and you can actually go into your styling, which I'm not going to cover, but you can actually change exactly how you want your headlines to look. So if you have it set to be an H2 or an H3, and when you go to actually look at the page, you don't really like the way it looks. For example, if you wanted this to be a little bit bigger font or underlined or whatever, there's ways to go into your website design and style it the way you want. And I would encourage you to do this if you don't like the way it's set up. But the main point we're talking about SEO here is to use H2s and H3s within your content to break it up, because again, people scan through web pages. Typically, someone will go to a page, they'll scroll through, look at the pictures, read the subheadlines, see what the page is about, and then scroll back up to the top and actually read the content. So now that you know this, take advantage of it and write great subheadlines.